We are all familiar with adventuring parties. They are a quintessential idea, some famous examples being the Mighty Nine from Critical Role and the Fellowship of the Ring. And I've always thought that the members of that party, which exist to help each other, should be able to come up with a camping system so that not everyone is carrying 100 pounds worth of gear, but everyone still has enough room in their tent. And I think I may have found a solution. Greetings adventurers, my name is Kramer and I just recently came back from my yearly winter camping trip. Me and all the boys get together and we go out into the woods and we camp while it's snowing. And on this journey I was able to try out a couple of different tarp setups for my own personal shelter. I of course was in more or less my medieval kit. I supplemented with some modern items just to make sure I was warm, but quite honestly a lot of my medieval kit is warmer and more practical than some of my modern clothes. So I sort of picked from here and picked from there and created my own sort of gear that I was going to wear. So the kit that I ended up with sort of made me look like Boffer from The Hobbit, but I really enjoyed these winter excursions even though they happen once a year because I always end up learning something. And I believe this time I'm getting closer to answering that question of how might medieval or fantasy adventurers combine their resources to make camping a more comfortable and enjoyable experience. Criteria for this was obviously that it had to more or less keep me warm, it had to keep me dry and protected from the wind, and it also had to be easy to set up and not too heavy. So the tarp that I brought was I believe it's a 10 by 10 waxed canvas tarp, and it's got tie-outs all along every one of the sides and down the middle. And the first way I set it up was in this sort of coffin pyramid shape. It's much longer in the back and it's got one single pole in the center. I used my walking stick for that. Now this is a very simple and structurally sound setup that many bushcrafters use if they happen to be using a tarp in the wild. It's very easy to set up and it's not going to come apart easily. And the purpose of a shelter like this is for me as a ranger to be self-sufficient so that I'm not relying on anybody else in order to keep myself and all of my gear dry for the night. And for the first night, this tarp shelter worked very, very well. There was about 2.5 feet to maybe 3 feet of actual headroom. But because of the way that this tarp is set up, you actually have very little headroom at the tallest point. It starts to drop off very steeply on all sides. And because there's also a tent pole right in the center, it also makes it difficult to actually utilize that headspace because you can't stand inside of the pole. You can't like just clip into it. So if I were to do it this way again, I try to tie it off if I could instead with a ridgeline. That way I'm not having to worry about there being a pole in the center of my tent. It was very cozy and there was enough room for me in this very low to the ground shelter. There was enough room for me to sleep on one side and all of my gear went on the other side. The thing with this though is because it's very coffin shaped. So you have the tall point here and then it sort of very steeply drops off and then you have probably just enough room for your feet. Even though there's a lot of square footage in terms of like space that the tarp covers, you're never actually gonna go down to the end where your feet are because it's just too small. You'd essentially have to lie down in order to get your hands over there to work with anything. So I was working with a very small area of practically usable space. The thing that was unintuitive to me about this is if I can, just as an animal instinctually, I would prefer to have my feet closer to the entrance than my head. It just seems safer, even though the whole thing is a tarp and it's not really going to protect me against anything. I just wanted to have my feet towards the entrance instinctually. But because the entrance is the tallest part of the tent, it made more sense to have my head be there, which meant that my head was very cold at night because the way that this tarp is sent up, it doesn't really have a door. It can close a little bit, but there's still about a foot's worth of room down by the bottom where it's just not going to close off. Another thing that wasn't really an issue for winter camping, but it might be an issue in other environments, is that there is of course no ground cover for this. It is an open bottom tent, so you are sleeping on whatever the forest floor just happens to be. When it's winter and everything's frozen and there's a lot of dead leaves, that's not as much of a problem. I didn't encounter any issues where my body heat from sleeping melted the snow wall around me and I was like waking up in some muddy puddle. So it was absolutely fine in this scenario, but in a wetter scenario, especially if it's raining, or if you are in a very buggy scenario, I just really don't like bugs, then I can see this open bottom of this tarp setup being slightly annoying to me, if not quite uncomfortable, to be honest. Speaking of winter and speaking of Christmas, I wanted to take a second to let you know that everything in my store, livinganachronism.com, is 15% off for the Christmas season. We have a lot of handmade wooden adventuring gear by the native Texas Craftsman Company, including this tankard, which is very nice and light and very, very big. Great for attending Renaissance festivals, if that's something you're going to do in 2025. These should be hitting the store probably by the time you're seeing this video. So Merry Christmas, and go ahead and check out my link in the description, livinganachronism.com. All that being said, for the first night, I was very cozy in there. There was enough room for me to get stuff done, and I've slept in smaller spaces before, so it was serviceably roomy. Now, the second day, my friend and I decided that since we both brought tarps and we had enough time to kill, what if we tried to combine our tarps into one larger tent? Now, we didn't really know what we were doing. We kind of just threw stuff together and tried to make something that looked more or less like a tent. And we succeeded for the most part. Until later. So essentially, we both set up our tarps as if they were a taco or a folded lean-to configuration. The only thing is that we decided to put the edges of our lean-tos together. So we both had a ground cloth and we both had a roof, and our roofs were sort of touching together, more or less. So we set up a ridge line, we staked out both of our tarps, and then we just joined them together. Now, in principle, this worked very, very well for the conditions that we were in at that time. We both had a ground cloth and we both had a wall protecting us. The problem was that given the way that we actually attached the tarps themselves to that ridge line, there was about a 2 to 2.5 inch gap up at the top where it was just the ridge line, and then there was this space, and then there were the tarps. So we essentially had a very long open ridge line, sort of a fake chimney. Now, inside was very roomy, despite there being 2 people in a tent now instead of just one. We were both very surprised that we actually had more usable space despite sharing it with each other than either of us had in our single-use tarp setups. And for the record, we both used the exact same tarp setup. It just so happens that his tarp was very modern and synthetic, that's why it's black, and mine is waxed canvas, though he bought it for me for Christmas, so he has good taste. My tarp was also 10 by 10. I believe his was 8 by 8, so mine was just a little bit larger than his. Now, what we decided to do when we set this up was actually, rather than going the entire length of the tarp, we went one, what are they called? We went one tie-out point in on each of ours, so we would have a flap at either end hanging off of the ridgeline. And my thought with this was we could use it to make a sort of door. So now we're looking at a tent that is large enough for 2 people and their gear, has a ground cover, has walls and a roof, and also has a back wall and a front door. Now, he had brought a separate ground cover, again, because he was camping modern. He had stuff that packed down very, very small, so that's why he was able to bring all the stuff. If I wanted to bring a ground cloth in addition to my waxed canvas tent, it would have been very heavy, because that waxed canvas is like 12 pounds or something like that. So we ended up using his ground cloth to make an entire, like, encompassing wall all the way around the back. And this meant that we could actually sleep with our heads towards the back and our feet towards the entrance, which made me feel much safer. But we still had enough headroom because the height of the tent, which was between, I want to say 3 and maybe 3.5 feet, was usable the entire length of the tent rather than just at one point like our original shelters were. So we were feeling pretty proud of ourselves. We were ready to make improvements in the future, but for not really having a plan and just sort of setting it up to see if we could, we were happy with the results. And that lasted for about another 6 hours. We ate dinner, we smoked our pipes around the fire, and we had a jolly good time. And then it started to snow. At about 11. It didn't let up. It was supposed to snow for like another 2 hours. So I didn't think I'd be filming, but I'm camping with my friends. Hello, everybody. Thank you for the light, John. It started snowing, and we didn't expect that to happen. We have a tent back here made out of 2 tarps. There'll be a better picture of it. We're gonna see how that works, and hopefully we survive the night, as Gimli would say. I think we will. I think we'll be fine. It's not that cold. But I wanted to document that this is in fact happening to prove that it's true. So began a very frantic, but fun experience of us trying very hard to weatherproof our tarps. I concocted this plan where we would take one edge of the roof and fold it over the ridgeline and therefore over the other edge, and then actually stake that down the wall on the other side. His tarp, even though it was smaller than mine, the waxed canvas is very stiff and therefore wasn't going to fold well. So we took the top of his tarp and staked it over the top of mine, down back into the floor. So there were a lot of guy lines around our tent in order to make this work. With some finagling, we were able to make that function. And the way that we made that front door was I took the corner of the free flap on my side of the tarp and staked it down to the bottom corner on the ground on his side of the tarp, and then I did the opposite thing. I took the flap on his side and staked it down over mine. So you end up with this sort of triangular wedge shape, sort of like a plow front. It didn't go all the way to the bottom, but it was enough to create this sort of slight awning to keep snow from piling up on our doorstep. And we were able to keep warm in our sleeping bags. And we had plenty of room. We had probably about 8 inches of space between the two of us where we were sleeping to use to store stuff, plus all of the room at the foot of the tent. There was just so much space. Massive pro for combining our tarps together like this. So in the morning, my friend, I don't know if it's okay if I name him. Sean, is it okay if I say your name? Anyway, my friend remarked that if we had actually used 2 guy lines instead, we might have avoided that problem. And it took me a little bit to see where he was coming from, but he's right. Because I was picturing 2 guy lines right next to each other, but he was picturing one much lower than the other and further in, I suppose. So the idea would be that you have the one tarp set up like this on one guy line, and then you have a lower one. So you have this sort of peaked, sloped roof idea going on, and that would lessen the problem of that seam. Now, the problem that I sort of have with that idea is, one, it now requires more materials. You need more guy line. That's totally a lesson that I learned with this too. Between the two of us setting up our 2 tarps, we didn't have enough rope to actually set out all the guy lines so that we could create the structure that then protected us from the snow. Luckily, all of my other guys brought extra rope because they thought ahead. This is something that belongs in my top 5 easily ignored pieces of gear that every adventurer needs, but I thought rope was just so obvious and so boring, and then I went ahead and forgot to bring as much rope as I needed, so lesson learned from that. But my problem with this sort of 2 guy line system, even though it works, is that, one, it takes the extra material of needing 2 guy lines, and then it therefore takes extra time to set up the 2 guy lines. It's not going to take you an hour. It's pretty quick to set one up, but it just does require more. And then at a certain point, if you already have one that's much taller than the other one, why not just fold it over like we did and use only one guy line? The mad struggle that we faced at 1 o'clock in the morning in the pitch dark while it's snowing all over us, trying to set this up so that it wouldn't get snow inside the tarp, would have been easily fixed if we had just set the guy line 3 to 4 inches lower, and then we would have had enough space to fold one of those over very easily. So the problem wasn't not having enough guy lines. The problem is we just didn't set it up properly. Another thing that I remarked upon was actually that because my tarp was 10 by 10, it was actually big enough to give us the exact same shape and size that we had when we combined our tarps all on its own. So if I had set my waxed canvas tarp up as an A-frame rather than a taco on its side like this, if I had set it up as an A-frame with an open bottom, we then could have used his ground cover or his tarp as the ground cover and had the exact same amount of space. There are pros and cons to doing it this way as well. A big pro is obviously that you now don't have to worry about the roof line having this massive seam that is potentially going to leak, especially if it's raining. A con that I can think of is that now there's a seam on the ground level where you're sleeping. So if it's highly windy, you might struggle with that. A solution to this is potentially to, if it's snowing, to cover that up with snow, to just sort of weigh it down. That way air can't go in, or if there's dirt or sand or whatever you have around you, weigh down the sides that way. And that's actually what I did with my first personal tarp. The way that it was set up, my middle tent pole was actually slightly too tall, so there was 4 inches of empty airspace around the bottom of my tent towards the front. So I actually packed snow all the way around it and sort of built this miniature wall. That way I didn't have air flowing into my tent. Now, something that I actually prefer about having the 2 tents in a lean-to configuration joined together is actually that the breakdown was, it was surprisingly simple and easy. I will explain. So with the 2 lean-tos together, if one of you takes your lean-to away, now you have all of the ample space to access your gear while you're breaking everything down and packing back up again. Whereas with an A-frame, I suppose you could stake it out and hold it open, but you're still limited by the height of the guy line there. Whereas if you have just the one guy line in the lean-to, now if you take one of those away, it's just a lean-to with 2 people's stuff sort of just on the ground. It's much easier to access and pack up. So he took down his side first, and then I didn't have to stoop or hunch or anything in order to roll up my sleeping bag. So I told him next time we did that, I'd pack up my tarp first. That way he could have the experience of packing up so nice and easy. There's no reason to tough it out and be all self-sufficient if you don't have to. Now, if I were a ranger out on my own in the wilderness and I had that one tarp, sure, I'd be absolutely fine. There's many different configurations you can set that up in. It's really not that heavy. I even did a video for Shad where I talked about how you could turn a cloak into a shelter too. Like, there's lots of ways to make it work. But the fact remains that I was more comfortable and I had more space when me and my buddy combined the powers of the materials that we had brought and made one larger tent. Everyone in our group said they were super jealous of us because we had so much space with our setup despite having to share it between two people. We both agreed that this is the way. And when I say it is the way, I don't necessarily mean that setting it up the exact same way that we set it up is the way. I just mean that if you can combine your materials to create something better than you could have just on your own, that's why you have an adventuring party. It's obviously true based on my experience with this that you can have more personal space while sharing that space with another person by combining your resources. And I believe I even talked about this concept in this video here about fantasy adventuring in real life, where if you have a party whose goal is to all help each other, then it makes sense that not everybody might have their own personal tents that they're carrying, but rather that everyone would carry a piece of a larger communal tent, or you would have people pairing off. Something like the Polish lavu cloak, where you wear them, you and your buddy wear them, and then when you take them off and button them together, you create this larger tent for the two of you to stay in. This concept makes a lot of sense to me, because if you have this party, why not utilize that manpower to create something big rather than all of you creating something very small and individual? So I'm very curious to see what sorts of advice everybody else has in terms of combining two tarps like this. That folded taco style, I really think we've got something there, and I'm very curious to see what other people say. Do you have experience with this? Have you come up with an even better setup? If so, please let us all know down in the comments below. I'll see you very soon. And in the meantime, I'd like to wish you good luck on your adventures.